Well, let me just state for the record that masks are not theater.
What are you going to do, arrest me?
Yes, for intruding on premises.
That's hilarious.
That's exactly what it is. Not relaxed at all.
Right here, people.
No, it is not. No, it's not.
Ma'am, I'll say if they ask you to leave, you have to leave.
My money's in this bank, and I'm going to take it out.
Well, then you have to
And
abide by the
after I do
rules,
that,
and you have to
the
have a mask
rules
on.
This is a state.
It's not. Businesses have the right to refuse service, even if you're not wearing a mask. That's their choice.
My money out.
Awesome. Well, you need to go and get a mask and then take your money out. You're not allowed to do.
I've been waiting here
Ma'am,
for about 10
listen,
minutes.
we're going to do this the easy way or the hard way.
What are you going to do, arrest me?
Yes, for intruding on premises.
That's hilarious.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and you believe in this?
I believe in it.
Do you believe in this?
The laws, yes.
The law says that I do not have to wear a mask.
You can not in public,
My
but you're not in public.
rights.
You're not in
My-
public.
Yes.
I'm not going to argue with you about this. This is not a public place. This is a private business. No, you're not. We're going to go outside.
Are you serious?
Do I look like I'm kidding?
Well, I don't know, because
Let's walk
obviously
outside.
you've got some issues
I've got issues.
that you're taking away
Okay.
people's human rights.
Okay. Let's go
Oh, now
outside.
is
Let's
he
go
going to
outside.
shoot me, people? Is
No.
he going to shoot me for trying not to breathe?
Cool.
Come
Cool.
on, dude.
Don't do that. Oh no.
Do not touch me. Who do you think you are?
2010, one
Oh,
resisting.
back up. Some old lady is getting handcuffed here. Here, people. Ow!
Ma'am,
Are
put your
you-
hands behind your back. Say, you don't stop resisting. Stop.
Is anybody gonna, like, get real here? Really?
Relax.
No one's gonna get real? Wow.
Come on.
Oh, are you gonna smash my head to the ground now? Now you're smashing my arm into my private area?
Your private area?
Yeah.
Put your hands behind your back.
My hand is behind my back, sir.
This one. Turn over on your stomach. Put your hand behind your back.
Someone's filming this. You're hurting me.
Oh, I'm filming it.
This is like cut.
Yeah,
This is
okay.
like cutting me.
Stand up. Stand up. Stand yourself up.
And how do you suggest, sir? I am like a 65-year-old woman here.
Okay. Sit
What are
up.
you doing? Are you happy now, lady?
Okay.
I'm not happy.
Okay, stand up. Stand up.
Effective next Wednesday, all businesses of any type are allowed to open 100%. Also, I am ending the statewide mask mandate.
Here we go again with the theater. Let's get down to the facts.
Given that no scientific studies have shown significant numbers of reinfections of patients previously infected or previously vaccinated, what specific studies do you cite to argue that the public should be wearing masks well into 2022?
I'm not sure I understand the connection of what you're saying about masks and reinfection. We're talking about people who have never been infected before
You're telling everybody to wear a mask, whether they've had an infection or a vaccine. What I'm saying is they have immunity, and everybody agrees they have immunity. What studies do you have that people that have had the vaccine or have had the infection are spreading the infection? If we're not spreading the infection, isn't it just theater?
No, it's
If you had
not.
a vaccine and you're wearing 2 masks, isn't that theater?
No, that's not. Here we go again with the theater. Let's get down to the facts. Okay, the studies that you quote from Crotty and Sete look at in vitro examination of memory immunity, which in their paper they specifically say this does not necessarily pertain to the actual protection. It's in vitro.
And what studies can you point to that show significant reinfection? There are no studies that show
Just
significant
let me finish the response to your question, if you please. The other thing is that when you talk about reinfection and you don't keep in the concept of variants, that's an entirely different ballgame. That's a good reason for a mask. In the South African study conducted by J&J, they found that people who were infected with wild type and were exposed to the variant in South Africa, the 351, it was as if they had never been infected before. They had no protection. So when you talk about reinfection, you've got to make sure you're talking about wild type. I agree with you that you very likely would have protection from wild type for at least 6 months if you're infected. But we in our country now have variants that are circulating.
Significant reinfection. What study shows significant reinfection, hospitalization, and death after either natural infection or the vaccine? It doesn't exist. There is no evidence that there are significant reinfections after vaccine. In fact, I don't think we have a hospitalization in the United States after the 2-week period after the second vaccination. We don't have a death in the United States.
You're not hearing what I'm saying about variants. We're talking about wild type versus variants.
And
now,
what proof is there that there are significant reinfections with hospitalizations and death from the variants? None in our country. Zero.
Well, because we don't have a prevalent of a variant yet. We're having one. Can I finish? We're having 117 that's becoming more dominant.
Your policy based on conjecture.
No,
have the
it isn't based
that we're
on
going to get
conjecture.
variants, so you want people to wear a mask for another couple years.
No.
You've been vaccinated and you parade around in 2 masks for show.
No.
You can't get it again. There's virtually 0% chance you're going to get it, and yet you're telling people that have had the vaccine, who have immunity. You're defying everything we know about immunity by telling people to wear a mask who've been vaccinated.
No.
Instead, you should be saying there is no science to say we're going to have a problem from the large number of people being vaccinated. You want to get rid of vaccine hesitancy? Tell them they can quit wearing their mask after they get the vaccine. You want people to get the vaccine? Give them a reward instead of telling them that the nanny state's going to be there for 3 more years and you got to wear a mask forever. People don't want to hear it. There's no science behind it.
Well, let me just state for the record that masks are not theater. Masks are protective. And we
You have
ask
immunity there, theater. If you already have immunity, you're wearing a mask to give comfort to others. You're not wearing a mask because of any science.
I totally disagree with you.
Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley were my former students in legislation in classes I taught at the Harvard Law School and the Yale Law School, respectively. I was thoroughly disgusted with the reprehensible behavior and the reprehensible language of both of my former students. I've been a law professor almost 40 years, the last 22 at Yale. Ted Cruz was a very memorable student. He was not a shrinking violet. I don't think he was very popular among his fellow students, but I think the faculty, including me, really enjoyed him as a student and respected him. Josh Hawley was quieter, vastly more popular with his fellow students. He was not as outspoken a class participant as Ted Cruz had been, and was not as outstanding a student. They were very conservative, they were very ambitious, they were presumably Republicans, and were going to advance through their connections politically. I couldn't bear to watch the insurrection and the sacking of the U.S. Capitol by the mob that had been directly incited by the President of the United States and indirectly incited by the President's supporters, including my student Josh Hawley, whose clenched fist as he entered the Capitol building surely played its own role in inspiring and inflaming the crowd. Both Cruz and Hawley tried to dress up irresponsible presidential claims with some Ivy League constitutional claims.
I look to history, to the precedent of the 1876 election, the Hayes-Tilden election, where this Congress appointed an electoral commission to examine claims of voter fraud. And what I would urge of this body is that we do the same, that we appoint an electoral commission to conduct a 10-day emergency audit.
Well, okay, he's very learned. He knows about that. But it's very inapt for a number of reasons. One reason is that the 1877 commission is a terrible precedent. It's a terrible precedent. Why? Because the Republicans stole that election. The Democrats, Tilden, got a majority of the vote. The loser, Hayes, his allies basically usurped, stole electors in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, where the popular majorities had been against the Republicans. And then if that's not enough, Senator Cruz seems to have conveniently forgotten that in 1877, the president didn't take office until March. And so the Electoral Commission was not under the time pressure in that year that it would have been in 2021.
Pennsylvania elected officials passed a whole new law that allows universal mail-in balloting. This was the statute that governed this last election, in which there are over 2.5 million mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court hasn't heard the case. There's no other court to go to hear the case in the state. And so this is the appropriate place.
This lawsuit after the election was asking the Pennsylvania judiciary to invalidate 2 million voters. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it in the history of presidential elections. It was not challenged in 2019, which the statute said if you're going to challenge it this year. It was not challenged in 2020, before the election at all. It was challenged in a bootless lawsuit after the election, which was unanimously rejected by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on the grounds that this was too late. I don't have any respect for the arguments, the legal arguments that are made by very intelligent people who know better, who know that these are illegitimate arguments. And they ultimately fall back on the idea, well, some of our constituents believe these kinds of arguments. And it seems to me that is the height of irresponsibility. And as far as anybody can gather, they were doing it for personal political gain.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, politicians do things for personal political gain, but you do not subvert our system of government for partisan political gain. I was raised as a Republican. I'm an independent. The Republicans are a party that has sold its soul. And so there's this other party, which is unrecognizable to me, whose members are terrified of criticizing a sociopathic president who seems to be holding them hostage electorally. George W. Bush, succeeded by Obama, almost 180-degree ideological turn. As far as I can gather, could not have been more gracious. President Obama, succeeded by somebody, it's not even 180 degrees. It's like a different universe. Could not have been more gracious. President Trump handing over to Joe Biden, the sorest, most bitter, sour grapes loser in American history. I think at the very least, the American people deserve an apology.
First thing that I heard, Mr. President, was that this bill was just too expensive. It's $1.9 trillion. That's a lot of money, no doubt. But this country has never, ever faced a healthcare crisis or an economic crisis like we do today. This is an unprecedented moment in our nation's history, and it requires us to step up and do something that isn't just going to sound like it will work and help people, but actually will. And what's, I guess to me, ironic about this claim that it's too expensive, that it's going to cost our kids and grandkids too much money, is that Republicans passed a tax bill that was almost to the dollar the exact same amount as this relief bill is. They passed a $1.9 trillion tax bill where the majority of the benefits went to the richest Americans who needed no more help. And so it's a little hard to listen to my Republican colleagues claim that this bill is too expensive when they were willing to spend the exact same amount of money in 2017 on tax cuts for their wealthy corporate and millionaire friends. It is also hard to listen to this argument because just a year ago, Republicans were willing to spend $1.9 trillion to address this crisis. It isn't as if Republicans haven't understood when they were in control of the White House and the Congress that we needed to step up and meet this moment. Republicans have said, well, this is different because we're turning the corner. Well, as Senator Durbin laid out very well, we may be able to see the corner, but we're not there yet. March 24th was the day that we passed the CARES Act, almost the same amount of money as we're considering today. On that day, 737 people died of COVID-19. Yesterday, 2,369 people died of COVID-19. So, in many ways, the crisis today is exponentially worse than it was a year ago, when Republicans, to a person, were willing to spend $2 trillion on the crisis. And by the way, the economic crisis is still acute. There may be technically more people at work today than there was in April or May of last year, but surveys suggest today 80% of Americans don't have enough money to pay their bills. Why? Because a lot of people are back to work, but they're working fewer hours, right? They have less reliable work. Here's the second critique that is made over and over about this bill. It's a partisan bill, Republicans say. Well, that is a complaint of Republicans' own making, because it is only a partisan bill in the United States Senate. 3 out of 4 voters support the American Rescue Plan. This is a recent Morning Consult poll. It's been referred to before on the floor. 70% of all voters support the American Rescue Plan. Not surprisingly, there's some difference between Democrats and Republicans, but frankly, not much. 90% of Democrats support the American Rescue Plan. 60% of Republicans support the American Rescue Plan. Why? Because everybody is hurting in this country. Everybody is hurting. This is a unifying proposal in the American public. And finally, Mr. President, this was maybe the most interesting theme of the complaints. It's not COVID relief. I've heard different statistics thrown out by my Republican friends. Some of them suggest only 5% of this bill is COVID relief. And I'm not sure exactly how they come to that calculation, but what I understand them to say is that anything that isn't directly related to putting shots in people's arms or treating people with present cases of COVID is not COVID relief. Well, let's just take a look at what was broadly part of the CARES Act that was supported by every single Republican, and what is broadly part of the American Rescue Plan. Because my Republican colleagues thought that everything in the CARES Act was COVID relief, whether it was designed to immediately attack the healthcare crisis or whether it was designed to address the economic crisis. There were stimulus checks in the CARES Act, not as big as the ones in the American Rescue Plan, but they were COVID relief when we passed the CARES Act. Now, according to Republicans, they're not COVID relief. There was an unemployment extension and a plus-up in the maximum benefit under the CARES Act. That was COVID relief back in March of last year, but now, according to Republicans, it's not COVID relief. There was money for vaccines and for testing in the CARES Act. In the American Rescue Plan, money for vaccines, testing. Small business relief was, of course, conceived in the CARES Act, the PPP program. That's a big part of the American Rescue Plan, but now it's not COVID relief, according to my Republican colleagues, whereas it was last year. There was state and local funding in the CARES Act. There's state and local funding in the American Rescue Plan. There was rent and mortgage relief in the CARES Act. There's rent and mortgage relief in the American Rescue Plan. All of a sudden, since Democrats took control of the White House and took control of the Senate, all of these things, which were categorized as COVID relief by Republicans in March, are no longer COVID relief. And so this idea that this is some Democratic wish list when we are essentially just extending or increasing the same funding streams that were in the CARES Act is nonsense. It's nonsense. Of course this is all COVID relief. Of course it is COVID relief when you are increasing nutritional benefits to people who can't afford to feed their kids because they've lost their job or they've lost hours because the economy melted down due to a pandemic. This bill is expensive, but it is not too expensive. This moment is unique, and we are mandated by our oath of office to meet this moment.
The real minimum wage, let's be honest, is not $7.25, it's $0 an hour.
You are clearly, an evangelist when it comes to not paying workers fairly.
My question to you is it the position of the Commonwealth Foundation that we shouldn't have a minimum wage at all?
Yeah, I would say there really is not a role here for the government to have a wage mandate. So yes, I would advocate for if we're going to do something, there are different tier minimum wages that we can do, but we see that the costs they outweigh the benefits.
So it is the position of the Commonwealth Foundation that we should not have a minimum wage.
Yeah, we think the minimum wage is harmful and an unnecessary policy.
I want to thank you first of all for your honesty. That your official position is that there should be no minimum wage. And so, if it's $1 an hour, sure, fine by the Commonwealth Foundation, fine by you. You are clearly, an evangelist when it comes to not paying workers fairly. So I want to ask you this morning, how much do you make a year, Ms. Stell?
Excuse me one second. Representative Kenyatta, let's keep the conversation focused on minimum wage.
Mr. Chairman, this is exactly about the minimum wage.
Please be courteous to the testifiers. You can ask questions, but please be polite, be courteous.
I think my question is perfectly polite, Mr. Chairman. We're talking about this morning the wages that Pennsylvanians make. Ms. Stell is a Pennsylvanian who works at the Commonwealth Foundation, which is across the street from our state capitol, and she is sitting here arguing that she is perfectly fine with folks making $15,000 a year. And so my question is, based on her personal experience, does she survive off of $15,000 a year? Do you make more than $15,000 a year, Ms. Stell?
I do not feel that I need to justify.
So I'll take that as a yes. My next question, I'll take that as a yes, Ms. Stell. Thank you. I'll just take it as a yes. Thank you. Going and looking at GuideStar, I could see that your CEO made $290,000 a year. Ms. Stell, should he make less?
Hold on. Representative Kenyatta.
Mr. Chairman, nobody else was interrupted.
Representative Kenyatta, you're comparing college graduates with 20 or 30 years of working experience with a high school kid working at a fast food restaurant.
Mr.
okay?
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, your description of who minimum wage workers is completely inaccurate. And there are college graduates in my district who are working 2 and 3 jobs. And so that mischaracterization, if that is the reason you're interrupting my questioning, I think is inappropriate. My question is, if she thinks that $15 is too much, should her CEO make less than the $290,000 that he makes a year? Would that be good for the economy based on her policy experience?
Well, first of all, I would say that personally speaking, at one point in my life, I did make the minimum wage, and I think we live in a country where you're rewarded for what you bring to the table, and so the real minimum wage, let's be honest, is not $7.25. It's $0 an hour, because if you don't think an individual is going to bring that much value, as an employee, you won't hire them.
I'm sorry, Ms. Snell, that you don't think hardworking people in my district bring anything to the table. I find that deeply disrespectful.
Really
Mr. Chairman, I find the comments that the testifier is making deeply disrespectful and disparaging.
Mr. Kenyatta.
Mr. Chairman.
No, Mr. Kenyatta.
Thank you.
You can't talk over the testifier. We're going to move on to the next questioner, which is
Mr. Chairman, I was not talking over the testifier. You were talking over me. I asked a series of two. Mr. Chairman, I asked just 2 yes or no questions, and that's all I'm asking for.
I would ask
yes or no, Mr. Chairman.
I would ask all members, please be courteous and polite with their testifiers. Don't overtalk people, and don't bring up issues that have nothing to do with what the topic is today.
Mr. Chairman, my only question was about wages, and I was routinely interrupted, Mr. Chairman, by you.
Mr. Kenyatta, you're not recognized right now. Who is recognized?
Yeah, because I'm bringing up something that you don't want to bring up. We have a panel here with no workers, and I'm asking questions of the person you brought to testify.
Okay, Representative.
It's fine. It's fine. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. It's fine. Go ahead.
Raising the minimum wage allows Pennsylvanians to work their way out of poverty. It saves tax dollars. It helps local communities. No one who works hard in Pennsylvania should be living in poverty, period. I'm pleased that the Biden administration also sees the importance of ensuring that workers earn a living wage. But Pennsylvania cannot wait for the federal government to act. We have a responsibility right here to the workers right here in Pennsylvania. And we must act now, right here in Pennsylvania, to raise our minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage will help workers. It will bring more money into local businesses. It will stimulate our economy, but most importantly, it is the right thing to do.
Now stop talking about Dr. Seuss and start working with us on behalf of the American workers. Mr. Speaker, one of the earlier speakers said, this is the most dramatic change in labor law in 80 years. And I say, thank God. In the late 70s, a CEO made 35 times the worker. Today, it's 300 to 400 times the worker. And our friends on the other side running around with their hair on fire. Heaven forbid we pass something that's going to help the damn workers in the United States of America. Heaven forbid we tilt the balance that has been going in the wrong direction for 50 years. We talk about pensions, you complain. We talk about the minimum wage increase, you complain. We talk about giving them the right to organize, you complain. But if we were passing a tax cut here, you'd be all getting in line to vote yes for it. Now stop talking about Dr. Seuss and start working with us on behalf of the American workers. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
We passed the COVID bill, everybody. We got it,
checks are coming out. Did we get everything we wanted? Absolutely not. But did we get things that are going to change people's lives? Absolutely yes. So if you are an adult that makes $75,000 or less as an individual, as a married couple up to $150K, I believe, then you will be getting a stimulus check. If you make more than $80K, you will not be receiving a stimulus check. Now, again, this was a huge point of contention for us. What did we do to fight back? We said, okay, you know what? If you're gonna try to take this away from people, which we don't agree with, what we demand is that the first $10,200 in unemployment income that people got in 2020 should be tax-free. And so we won that. Even though they brought it and they said $1,400, what we pushed back with was, okay, if you're gonna do that, then we need to include dependents and we need to include adult dependents. So while we wanted it to be $2K for all, what we were able to do is that even though it was $1,400, we were able to bring a lot of people from $0 to $1,400. So everything from bun in the oven to 17 years old, you will get recurring checks this year starting 90 days from now. Between the time you start getting your recurring checks and the end of the year, you will get $3,000 per child above the age of 6 and up to the age of 17. And if you have a child 6 or under, it is $3,600. Unemployment was set to expire like 3 days from now. We have extended it $300 every week through September. If you lost a loved one due to the COVID-19 pandemic last year, and you incurred funeral expenses, burial expenses, any expense for putting your loved one to rest, we will pay you back up to $7,000 in expenses. In this bill, if you have COBRA, it will be paid for, your premium will be paid for 100% until about September. So you don't need to pay COBRA anymore. If you get your health insurance off the exchange, there are really important changes that mean you will pay less money and that it will not be as expensive for you. The federal government is also going to cover a larger share of Medicaid expenses for states that haven't expanded through the ACA. If your state has been cutting back services, if they are not hiring firefighters, if they stopped construction on bridges, if your school is struggling to reopen because they aren't able to make the infrastructure investments necessary, there is money here to help states not cut off their services or restart their services and not have to lay off a ton of people. We all want schools to reopen, but we don't want to put people at risk. And so what this allows us to do is create a path that is as safe as we can make it to help schools reopen safely. And there's no mandate in this bill, so it's still up to your community and leadership. $28 billion in grants for restaurants, free money, because we know that hospitality, restaurants, bars, venues got hit especially hard during the pandemic. And so they're on top of PPP, there's extra relief targeted to hospitality. And as someone who comes from the hospitality world, that worked in waitressing and bartending and venues, it's just it's really close to our hearts, especially in New York City. So we're really, really excited to have that provision included in the bill. Now, before everyone gets ahead of themselves, there is not student loan cancellation in this bill, but there is a provision that feels like an Easter egg, which I think gives us some hope. There is a tax provision tucked away that says if your student loans get canceled, that cancellation, you don't have to pay taxes on that cancellation. There's no student debt cancellation in the bill. So this provision that's tucked in, I think tells us, like, if you care about student debt cancellation, it's go time for you. You need to mobilize, and now is the time to organize, to create the political pressure, because in there, tucked away, is almost like a little, someone's paving the path. There's a lot of stuff that there is left to be desired, that we need to build power to get. But the way that we build power is by acknowledging our achievements along the way, hype ourselves up, and then move on to continue on to the next fight. Because we got a lot of fight ahead. We have a lot of work ahead, but this is major, major.
The worst cruelty is the chicken breeds Costco uses. They grow unnaturally large, unnaturally fast. The result is devastating for the birds.
lies casting Black Lives Matter as violent have already done real damage. One of our colleagues said last week about the events of January 6th was felt by many to be racist and hurtful, a stain on the office he is so fortunate to hold. Look, I get no one likes to be called racist, but sometimes there's just no other way to describe the use of bigoted tropes that for generations have threatened Black lives by stoking white fear of African Americans and Black men in particular. On a radio show, our colleague explained that he never feared for his safety during the January 6th insurrection of the U.S. Capitol. But make no mistake, under different circumstances, he would have been afraid.
Had the tables been turned and President Trump won the election, and those were tens of thousands of Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters, I might have been a little concerned.
Is that not racism, Mr. President? And I don't think the senator is ignorant of the fact that for centuries in this country, white supremacy has thrived on using fear to justify oppression, discrimination, and violence against people of color. I do, however, think my colleague may be ignorant of the pain caused by his comments and unaware of how they compound the trauma that so many still feel in the wake of the events of January 6th. And because I do not think I can do justice to that pain, I want to share with you an email I received this weekend. It's from one of the most devoted public servants I have ever had the pleasure of working with, an African American member of my staff. I would not normally send you an email like this, but I am at a loss of how to express the outrage and hurt I am feeling by the comments made by Senator Johnson that he would have been more afraid on January 6th if the insurrectionists would have been from Black Lives Matter. I am blessed to be a member on your staff and have had the opportunity to serve as a staff member in the New Jersey delegation for 34 years, but this is the most painful thing I have ever heard being said by a U.S. Senator. I could not imagine that the horrible and painful events from January 6th could be replicated in a statement from a sitting member of the Senate. These comments is worse than the image of the insurrectionist walking through the Capitol building with a Confederate flag. He is perpetrating the racist trope that the country should fear Black people. I have experienced what it's like to have a taxi cab pass you by in order to pick up white passengers who are further down the block of where you're standing. Nothing can describe the feeling when you have entered a store and having store clerks watch your every step while shopping. Sandy, that's his wife, and I have had conversations with our sons when they were young about how to enter a store, not look suspicious, keep your hands out of your pockets until you make your purchase, or how to respond and talk to police officers in any interaction. I've had the difficult conversation of explaining to a young Black scouter in our scout troop why a white campground store clerk accused him of not paying for an item because he was Black. This type of hate speech is not new. The hardest part of what he said is that in 2021, a United States Senator would so freely express this type of hate out loud. I'm so grateful for our officers who endured so many injuries on January 6th, and I pray that they will recover physically and mentally. They are going through so much right now. I feel guilty that my email to you might sound shallow because of the pain that they are trying to overcome. I understand the Senate works best when both sides can find common ground. But how do you really reach common ground when such views can be held? Again, I'm sorry for reaching out late on Saturday evening, but I needed to share this with you. Keith. Mr. President, to read these pained words both broke my heart and boiled my blood. Thousands of people of color serve in the United States Capitol workforce. There are legislative staffers like Keith and Capitol police officers and maintenance workers, cafeteria staff, and so much more. I should not have to stand here and remind anyone that many of them feared for their lives on January 6th. But not Senator Johnson. He felt no fear.
I knew those are people that love this country, that truly respect law enforcement, would never do anything to break a law, and so I wasn't concerned.
Mr. President, people who love this country do not desecrate our most sacred democratic institutions and display symbols of racial hatred like the Confederate flag in the halls of Congress. People who respect law enforcement do not assault Capitol Police officers, beat them within inches of their death, and hurl ugly epithets like officers of color. People who would never do anything to break the law, would not try to overturn the rule of law, plot to kill elected officials, and stop the peaceful transfer of powers instructed by the Constitution of the United States. Now, I know what some right-wing media pundits and some of my Republican colleagues will say. They say it every time that they are asked to accept some responsibility for perpetuating the lies told by President Trump that inspired the violent events of January 6th. They say, what about Black Lives Matter? They say, well, what about it? Well, I say, well, what about it? The violent picture they paint of this movement could not be more divorced from reality. At this point, several reputable studies have confirmed that the protests launched in the wake of George Floyd's chilling murder were overwhelmingly peaceful. I repeat, the Black Lives Matter movement is overwhelmingly peaceful. I know many people don't care about facts these days, but it is the truth. One study out of Harvard University analyzed 7,305 Black Lives Matter protests. The conclusion? Allow me to quote Professor Erica Chenoweth. She said, quote, only 3.7% of the protests involved property damage or some form of vandalism. Some portion of these involved neither police nor protesters, but people engaging in vandalism or looting alongside the protests. In short, our data suggests that 96.3% of events involved no property damage or police injuries, and in 97.7% of events, no injuries were reported among participants, bystanders, or police. Likewise, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, an organization I might add is partially funded by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, examines 7,750 different Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the nation last summer. They found just 3% of those protests associated with any violence or property destruction whatsoever. They also concluded that police departments, quote, disproportionately use force while intervening in demonstrations associated with the Black Lives Matter movement relative to other types of demonstrations. Indeed, on January 6th, as we waited for hours for backup from the National Guard and other law enforcement agencies to come to the aid of Congress, I know that I'm not the only one who could not help but think of the violent government-sanctioned crackdowns that met Black Lives Matter's protests last summer. The bottom line is that these lies casting Black Lives Matter as violent have already done real damage. They have convinced millions of Americans that they should fear those who march under the banner of this movement for justice, when really it is the resurgence of violent white supremacy that should be Americans' real cause for alarm. Indeed, last October, the Department of Homeland Security issued a report confirming that white supremacists pose the most lethal domestic terror threat to the American people. And research from the Center for Strategic and International Studies finds that white supremacists and their sympathizers carried out 2/3 of terrorist plots and attacks in 2020. In the weeks since January 6th, we have learned that far-right extremist groups that regularly preach white supremacy, such as the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, played a major role in plotting and executing the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Everybody in this body should know that when you perpetuate such racist tropes, you contribute to a culture that gives people permission to treat Black Americans as suspicious and their lives as expendable. We in the United States Senate are supposed to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We're supposed to advance America's long march towards a more perfect union, not coddle and cater to those who would take us backwards. And we are supposed to stand up for the truth. And that's what brought me to the floor today.
Pregnant women are going to fight our wars. It's a mockery of the U.S. military. So we've got new hairstyles and maternity flight suits. Pregnant women are going to fight our wars. It's a mockery of the U.S. military. While China's military becomes more masculine as it's assembled the world's largest navy, Our military needs to become, as Joe Biden says, more feminine, whatever feminine means anymore, since men and women no longer exist. The bottom line is it's out of control, and the Pentagon's going along with this. Again, this is a mockery of the U.S. military.
We're making good progress designing body armor that fits women properly, tailoring combat uniforms for women, creating maternity flight suits, updating requirements for their hairstyles. And some of it is going to take an intensity of purpose and mission to really change the culture and habits that cause women to leave the military.
Women have served, fought, and died for this country for hundreds of years. The Pentagon really furious that they even have to discuss this, that he would bring this up, because it's frankly so ridiculous. The Pentagon press secretary adding to it a little while ago, speaking out publicly about the Pentagon's views and the views of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
What we absolutely won't do is take personnel advice from a talk show host or the Chinese military. Now, maybe those folks feel like they have something to prove. That's on them. The secretary certainly shares the revulsion of so many others to what Mr. Carlson said in his opening statement.
I don't watch a lot of drama TV. I understand some comments were made yesterday, and I watched the clip that Mr. Carlson produced as he referred to pregnant women in the military. I'll remind everyone that his opinion, which he has a right to, is based off of actually 0 days of service in the armed forces. Let me offer you my opinion. My opinion is based off of 28 years of actual service in the military, 28 years in the Marine Corps, in combat operations out at sea and in garrison. And so he was talking specifically about pregnant women in the armed forces today and how it makes us less lethal and less fit and less ready. Let me tell you where he's wrong. Those decisions were made by medical professionals, by commanders, and our civilian leadership that allows for women to have more time with their children, to recuperate, to get fit and ready, to take that time that's necessary that our medical professionals know is needed, which actually makes us a more lethal and ready and fit force, ready to fight the wars of today and the wars of tomorrow. The bottom line is that we value women in our armed forces. We value those that have served in the past, and we value those that have served today.